Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Shadows of Red Oak Lodge, a True Haunting. Part 1. The Abandoned Lodge. In the fall of 2005, 6 college friends from a nearby university decided to spend a weekend at Red Oak Lodge. Eric, the most adventurous of the group, had discovered the lodge through an old map he had found in the campus library. The map detailed long-forgotten trails leading to a secluded, abandoned hunting cabin deep in the forests of Pennsylvania. The lodge had a reputation. Locals warned of strange occurrences surrounding the area, whispers in the woods, people going missing, and an overwhelming sense of dread that fell over anyone who wandered too close. But for Eric and his friends, these stories were just that, stories. They dismissed the warnings, eager for a weekend of fun. The lodge had been abandoned for decades. Time had not been kind to the stone structure. Vines crawled up its walls, and the windows were clouded with dirt. The air seemed unnaturally still as the group approached, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss that had overtaken the path. The lodge stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the ground. As they crossed the threshold, the air inside the cabin felt colder, almost as if the lodge itself had been waiting for them. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture, though intact, was worn and weathered, with strange scratches marring the wooden floors. The group set up their things, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over them. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows outside grew longer, swallowing the cabin in darkness. Eric built a fire in the large stone fireplace, hoping the warmth would lighten the mood. But no matter how high the flames danced, the room remained cold. They all laughed it off, cracking jokes and drinking, trying to ignore the creeping sense that something was watching them from the shadows. That night, as they sat around the fire telling ghost stories, strange noises began to echo from the walls, soft creaks, as if something was walking above them. The group paused, listening, but when the sound stopped, they shrugged it off as the house settling. Little did they know, these noises were just the beginning. Part 2. The Unseen Presence. The first night passed without incident, but sleep came fitfully for most of them. Eric had woken up several times, his heart pounding, convinced that someone or something was standing in the room watching him. But every time he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but the faint glow of embers from the dying fire. The next morning, the group explored the surrounding forest, hoping to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. The woods were dense and oppressive, with tall, ancient trees that blocked out the sky. The further they ventured, the more isolated they felt. The path grew narrower, the air colder, and a strange silence hung over the area. No birds sang, and no animals scurried through the underbrush. As they hiked deeper into the forest, they stumbled upon something strange: an old cemetery, its tombstones weathered and crumbling, hidden beneath the roots of towering oaks. Some of the graves appeared to have been disturbed, the earth above them cracked and broken, as if something had clawed its way out. A shiver ran down Eric's spine as he stood before one of the gravestones, its inscription too faded to read. There, at the base of the stone, lay a pile of small, carefully arranged stones, forming a perfect circle. Unease spread through the group, and they quickly decided to head back to the lodge. But as they retraced their steps, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had once seemed so serene, now felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that followed them with every step. That night, the atmosphere in the lodge grew heavier. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. The group huddled together in the living room, trying to ignore the strange creaks and groans that came from the walls. But the noises grew louder, more insistent, and then They heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Part 3. The first encounter. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth on the creaky wooden floors above them. Eric, ever the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Two of his friends, David and Sarah, joined him as they ascended the old staircase, which groaned under their weight. The rest of the group stayed behind, huddled near the fire, their eyes wide with fear. The upstairs hallway was dark, with only the faint beam of Eric's flashlight cutting through the shadows. The air was thick, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them as they moved down the hall. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence. At the end of the hallway stood a door, one they hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and from the crack, a sliver of darkness seeped out, as if the room beyond held something far worse than they could imagine. Eric hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He pushed it open slowly. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair facing the window. The moonlight streamed in, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But it wasn't the chair or the shadows that caught their attention, it was the figure standing by the window. A tall, gaunt figure, its back turned to them, its head slightly bowed as if it was staring out into the woods. "Hello," Eric called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. David stepped forward, but before he could say anything, the figure turned. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through them. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and in a voice that wasn't quite human, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, the figure vanished. Part 4. The whispers begin. After the encounter in the upstairs room, the group was on edge. They tried to rationalize what they had seen, convincing themselves that it was just their imaginations running wild. But deep down, they knew something was wrong with the lodge. That night, as they sat around the fire, a new sound emerged, soft whispers, barely audible, but unmistakable. They seemed to come from the very walls of the lodge, as if the house itself was trying to speak to them. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. Melissa, one of the more sensitive members of the group, was the first to crack. She insisted that the whispers were calling her name, beckoning her to follow them into the forest. She became increasingly agitated, pacing the room and muttering to herself. The others tried to calm her down, but nothing seemed to help. At some point during the night, Melissa disappeared. The group searched the entire lodge, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as they realized she must have gone outside, into the dark, foreboding woods. They split up, searching the forest with flashlights, calling her name. But the woods were vast, and the thick fog made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each passing minute. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching their every move. Hours later, they found Melissa near the old cemetery, standing in the middle of one of the disturbed graves. She was barefoot, her clothes soaked with dew, and her eyes were wide with terror. "It's coming for us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't have come." Part 5. The haunting escalates. The group managed to get Melissa back to the lodge, but she was never the same. She refused to speak about what had happened in the woods, but her behavior became increasingly erratic. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming that the figure from the upstairs room was standing at the foot of her bed. The whispers continued, growing louder with each passing night. The group was on edge, their nerves frayed from the constant sense of dread that hung over them. They began to see shadows moving in the corners of their vision, figures that would disappear as soon as they turned to look. One night, as they sat around the fire, the door to the lodge slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows across the room. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening now, and they seemed to be coming from all around them. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their flashlights, but the batteries had died. The only light came from the pale moonlight streaming through the windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to hum with a dark energy. Eric, the most rational of the group, tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to bore into him, filling him with a terror unlike anything he had ever felt. Without warning, the figure disappeared, leaving the group in stunned silence. But the oppressive feeling in the room remained, as if the entity was still there, watching, waiting. Part 6. The Descent into Madness. By the next day, the group was unraveling. Melissa had retreated into herself, barely speaking and refusing to leave her room. The others were on edge, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified of what might come next. They had no way to contact the outside world, and the storm that had rolled in overnight made leaving impossible. The lodge had become a prison, its once familiar walls now oppressive and suffocating. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if the house itself was trying to communicate with them. The group was barely sleeping, plagued by nightmares of the figure they had seen in the doorway. Eric, ever the skeptic, tried to maintain some sense of control. He spent hours reading the journal they had found in the basement, trying to make sense of the strange events that were happening to them. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Hawthorne, the lodge's previous owner. The entries were erratic, detailing strange occurrences that mirrored their own experiences, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of dread. The final entry was chilling in its simplicity. I cannot leave. It won't let me. Part 7. The Descent into Madness. By the seventh night, the weight of their isolation and the growing supernatural occurrences had taken a severe toll on the group. What had once seemed like a harmless adventure had turned into a waking nightmare. Melissa had become nearly catatonic, rocking back and forth in her room, her eyes vacant, staring at something none of them could see. Eric and the others were physically and emotionally exhausted, barely able to sleep, haunted by constant whispers and fleeting shadows. The storm outside had not relented, battering the windows of the lodge with fierce winds and rain. The sense of being trapped was overwhelming, as if the forest and lodge themselves were conspiring to keep them inside. Every time someone suggested they leave, the storm outside grew fiercer, almost in response to their thoughts. Eric, ever the rational one, was losing his grip. He had been reading more of the journal they had found in the basement, the one belonging to Samuel Hawthorne. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, the entries grew darker and more erratic. Hawthorne had written about strange rituals performed by the previous owners of the lodge, deep in the woods. They believed the land was cursed, and only through sacrifice could they appease the dark presence that inhabited it. The others were becoming increasingly paranoid, their nerves frayed from lack of sleep and constant fear. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent them into a panic. It was as if the house was alive, feeding off their fear. They heard voices sometimes in their heads, sometimes in the hallways, but when they followed the voices, they found nothing. The line between reality and madness was growing thinner by the hour. That night, the atmosphere inside the lodge shifted. The fire in the hearth refused to stay lit, sputtering out no matter how many logs they threw into it. The cold seeped into their bones, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over the house. The whispers, which had become a constant presence, had stopped. The sudden absence of sound was even more unnerving. As they huddled together in the living room, Eric spoke up, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now, before it's too late." David, the most physically imposing of the group, stood up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "There's no leaving," he whispered, glancing towards the dark hallway where the figure had been seen the night before. "It won't let us leave." Suddenly, the door to the lodge slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The wind outside howled, and the walls creaked under the strain. The fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. Eric grabbed the flashlight, but the batteries had drained once again. His hands shook as he tried to light a candle, the flickering flame casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The footsteps continued, growing louder, as if whatever was upstairs was getting closer. Melissa, who had been silent for hours, suddenly stood up, her eyes wide and wild. "It's coming," she whispered. "It's coming for us." Part 8. The Offering. As Melissa's words echoed in the dimly lit room, the temperature dropped sharply, and the oppressive silence that had filled the air moments before was broken by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from within the walls. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural presence that made it hard to breathe. David and Sarah backed away from the door, their faces pale with terror. Even Eric, who had always been the most skeptical of the group, could no longer deny that something malevolent was closing in on them. Suddenly, the door to the upstairs hallway creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor that stretched into the shadows. Melissa stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the door, as though she was being drawn toward it by an invisible force. "It wants one of us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "It needs a sacrifice." The others stared at her in disbelief, but deep down, they all felt the same overwhelming sense of dread. The lodge had become a living entity, and whatever haunted it was growing stronger by the minute. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold, it had all been building toward this moment. Without warning, Melissa started walking toward the hallway. Eric grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she wrenched free with surprising strength. "I have to go," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's the only way." David, still reeling from everything they had experienced, stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "We can't let this happen," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to fight this together." But Melissa's eyes were distant, her face pale and gaunt. "It's too late," she said softly. "It already knows we're here. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." At that moment, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the floorboards creaked as if something massive was moving beneath them. The temperature plummeted further, and the oppressive darkness closed in around them. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, as though the very fabric of the lodge was unraveling. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of something large and heavy being dragged across the floor. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he realized whatever had been lurking in the shadows was no longer content to watch from afar. In a panic, they ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard David pushed or kicked, the door remained firmly shut. "We're trapped," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're trapped in here with it." Melissa, now standing at the base of the stairs, turned to face them. Her expression was blank, as though she was no longer in control of her own body. "It needs one of us," she repeated, her voice distant. "And it's going to take me." Before anyone could stop her, she started ascending the stairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. The others called out to her, begging her to stop, but she didn't respond. It was as if the entity had taken control, guiding her toward whatever dark fate awaited her. The rest of the group stood frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. They could hear the thing upstairs, waiting for her, its presence a palpable weight in the air. And yet, none of them moved to stop her. Some part of them understood that Melissa's fate had been sealed the moment they had set foot in the lodge. As she reached the top of the stairs, the door to the upstairs room creaked open. The darkness beyond was thick and impenetrable, but they could feel the malevolent presence lurking within. Melissa stepped inside without hesitation, the door closing behind her with a soft click. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The whispers had stopped, and the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift, as if the lodge itself had been appeased. But then, from behind the door, they heard a sound that chilled them to their core, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Part 9. The Sacrifice. For what felt like hours, the remaining three stood frozen in place, staring at the door Melissa had disappeared through. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The oppressive atmosphere that had lifted for just a brief moment returned with even greater intensity. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and a deep chill settled into their bones. Eric, David, and Sarah exchanged terrified glances, unsure of what to do next. They could still hear the faint sounds of something moving behind the door, but none of them had the courage to move. The growling they had heard earlier was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence that filled every corner of the lodge. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We can't just leave her up there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if she's still alive?" David shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "Melissa is gone. You saw her. Whatever that thing is, it took her." Eric felt a pit of dread growing in his stomach. He had been reading more of Hawthorne's journal, desperately searching for answers in the frenzied handwriting. He turned to the last few pages and found something that sent a chill through his spine. The journal mentioned an ancient ritual performed by the previous owners of the lodge, a sacrifice to the Watcher's malevolent spirits said to inhabit the forest. The spirits demanded one life every generation to keep their wrath at bay. They knew, Eric muttered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. They knew all along that this place was cursed. The journal talks about the sacrifices, the ritual. Melissa was the offering. David's face contorted with horror. "You mean they built this place knowing it was some kind of sacrificial ground?" Eric nodded. "They believed it was the only way to keep the spirits contained. But the spirits have been waiting, and now they're taking what they believe is owed." As Eric spoke, the lights in the lodge began to flicker violently. The temperature dropped even further, and the oppressive whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. The entire lodge groaned under the weight of something ancient, something angry. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave right now." But just as they turned to make their escape, the door to the upstairs room creaked open once more. A figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow, barely visible against the darkness. For a split second, they thought it was Melissa, but as the figure stepped into the dim light of the hallway, they realized with growing horror that it was not her at all. The figure was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. Its face was twisted, inhuman, and its body seemed to shimmer and distort, as if it were made of smoke. It moved with an eerie grace, its footsteps silent as it descended the stairs. David, Eric, and Sarah backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure moved toward them, its presence suffocating, its eyes locked on them with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through their bodies. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the door. But the figure was faster. It was suddenly in front of them, blocking their path, its inhuman eyes gleaming with malice. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their incessant chant. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls warping and twisting under the weight of the malevolent presence. David, panicking, lunged at the figure, but his hands passed right through it as if it were made of mist. The figure didn't react, its gaze still fixed on Eric and Sarah. And then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, passing through David's body like a gust of freezing wind. David gasped, his body convulsing as the spirit passed through him, leaving him crumpled on the floor, his eyes wide open in shock. Eric and Sarah stood frozen in terror as David lay lifeless at their feet. The figure turned its attention back to them, its eyes burning with a terrifying hunger. Part 10. The final hour. Eric and Sarah stared in disbelief at David's still body, their minds unable to process the horror they had just witnessed. The figure loomed over them, its yellow eyes glowing brighter, a grotesque smile stretching across its twisted face. They could feel the weight of the entity's presence bearing down on them, like an invisible force squeezing the life out of them. "We need to go," Eric whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the sound of the pounding in his ears. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen door, their only hope of escape. As they sprinted across the room, the figure moved toward them with inhuman speed, its form blurring and distorting. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, filling their minds with incoherent thoughts. The walls of the lodge seemed to close in on them, warping and twisting under the weight of the malevolent presence. Just as they reached the kitchen door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire lodge. Eric grabbed the handle, frantically pulling at it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was sealed, as if by some invisible force. Panic rose in his chest as he realized they were trapped. Sarah was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. Eric didn't have an answer. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but every door, every window was sealed. The entity was closing in on them, and there was no escape. Suddenly, the air in the room grew thick and heavy. The temperature dropped even further, and the oppressive darkness seemed to grow, swallowing the dim light from the flickering candles. The figure loomed closer, its twisted form barely visible in the shadows. But then, from somewhere deep within the lodge, a new sound emerged, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the halls, louder than the whispers. It was a sound of unimaginable pain and sorrow, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. The entity paused, its attention drawn away from Eric and Sarah for a brief moment. The wailing grew louder, filling the lodge with its haunting cry. It was as if the very walls of the lodge were crying out in agony. Eric and Sarah exchanged a glance. This was their only chance. Without a word, they turned and ran toward the back of the lodge, where they had seen an old cellar door. It was their last hope. The figure seemed distracted, its attention focused on the wailing sound, giving them a brief window of opportunity. They reached the cellar door and pulled it open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The stairs leading down into the darkness were steep and narrow, but they didn't hesitate. They descended into the blackness, the sound of the wailing growing louder and more intense. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, damp room. The air was musty, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old, rotting books and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a stone altar covered in dark stains. The wailing was coming from the walls themselves, as if the lodge was alive, mourning the lives it had claimed over the years. Eric and Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. But before they could move, the cellar door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into complete darkness. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding them, filling their minds with terror. The figure was coming for them, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. Eric frantically searched the room for anything that could help them, his hands shaking as he fumbled through the shelves. But there was nothing, no weapons, no tools, nothing that could save them. The figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. And then, in a moment of clarity, Eric realized what they had to do. The journal had mentioned a ritual, a way to end the curse, to banish the entity back to the darkness from which it had come. "We need to perform the ritual," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. "It's the only way." Sarah nodded, her face pale with fear, but she trusted him. With trembling hands, they placed their hands on the altar, reciting the words from the journal. The room began to shake, the whispers growing more frantic, as if the entity knew what they were doing. The figure lunged toward them, its inhuman form distorting and twisting in the darkness. But as they spoke the final words of the ritual, a blinding light filled the room, and the entity let out a deafening scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The lodge was silent. Eric and Sarah collapsed to the floor, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, and the whispers were gone. The entity had been banished. But as they made their way out of the lodge, they couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows, watching them, waiting.